Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
1846, President James K. Polk ordered American troops into disputed territory along the Rio Grande. He knew Mexican forces were in the area. He knew a confrontation was likely. That was the point. When Mexican forces responded, Polk had his incident. He told Congress that Mexico had shed blood upon American soil. The war he wanted was delivered. The territory he sought was conquered. Abraham Lincoln, a young congressman at the time, he called him out on it. He demanded Polk identify the particular spot of soil where blood was shed. He called the war a product of, and I'm going to quote this, the exceeding brightness of military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood. Lincoln had a way with words, didn't he? Lincoln's critique cost him politically. He was labeled unpatriotic, and he did not seek re-election in the House. Now, Lincoln, of course, would return to politics, and he'd oversee a much larger showers of blood just over a decade later with the outbreak of the Civil War. An outbreak which is in no small part a result of the domestic consequences from Polk's expansion. But on Polk's Mexican-American War, Lincoln's analysis proved correct. The war was manufactured. The casus belli was pretextual. The critics were marginalized, and the template was established. A template that's been used ever since. The Maine in 1898, the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, weapons of mass destructions in 2003, and several more. And it's being used right now in Venezuela, in Iran, and in the renewed talk of American territorial expansion. Today, we examine current events through the lens of what we learned this last week in episode 2. The patterns are unmistakable. The question is, are we going to recognize them in time? I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 2, part B, a contemporary application episode corresponding Article 2, Chapter 2, Episode 2 from the series Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. In our Saturday episode, we examined how the Mexican-American War established a template for imperial conflict, executive provocation, manufactured casus belli, congressional acquiescence, critics marginalized. Today, we apply that template to current events, and I'm going to start with Venezuela. At the beginning of this year, January 3rd, 2026, American forces conducted what the administration called Operation Absolute Resolve. The military extraction of Venezuela President Nicolas Maduro and his wife from Caracas. They were brought to American soil to face charges in a New York federal court. We talked about this in an earlier episode. The legal justification offered was narco-terrorism. Maduro, we were told, was the kingpin of a vast criminal organization called the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had declared that Maduro was not the president of Venezuela, but the head of the Cartel de los Soles, a narco-terror organization that had taken possession of this country. And that's important because the justification to conservatives was that this wasn't foreign adventurism, this wasn't a foreign war, this was just a law enforcement exercise. And they made it very clear over the next couple of weeks, this was a law enforcement episode to serve an indictment from 2020 on this cartel kingpin. We talked about it on the previous episode, comparing it to Noriega, comparing it even to Pablo Escobar. There's just one tiny problem. When the Department of Justice filed its revised indictment, the one that would actually have to be proven in court, the Cartel de los Soles effectively vanished from that document. The original 2020 indictment mentioned the cartel more than 30 times and labeled Maduro as its leader. But the January 2026 revision mentions it only twice, and not as an organization at all. Instead, prosecutors now describe it as a patronage system and a culture of corruption. You understand what happened? For months, the administration built its case for intervention on the claim that Maduro led a terrorist drug cartel. The Treasury Department designated the Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization. The State Department did the same. The drumbeat of rhetoric was relentless. Maduro the drug lord, Maduro the narco-terrorist, Maduro the cartel kingpin. But when prosecutors had to prove these claims in court, where evidence matters, where assertions must be substantiated, they quietly backed away. The cartel they had invoked to justify regime change turned out to be, in the words of the International Crisis Group, far from reality. Elizabeth Dickinson of the International Crisis Group told the New York Times that designations don't have to be proved in court. And that's the difference. Phil Gunson, a Caracas-based analyst, was more direct. Cartel de los Soles per se doesn't exist. It's a journalistic expression. A former senior U.S. official speaking to CNN described it as a made-up name used to describe an ad hoc group of Venezuelan officials involved in trafficking. It doesn't have a hierarchy or command and control structure of a traditional cartel. Look, Venezuelan officials may well be corrupt. I don't doubt that at all. Drug trafficking may well flow through Venezuelan territory with official connivance. I'm sure of that too. I'm not here to defend Maduro's government. I mean, do I even have to say this? Okay, maybe for new listeners. Look, I'm a libertarian. I abhor socialism, collectivism, and what Chavez and Maduro politicked for and how they ran that country into the ground on failed ideology and corruption. Abhor it. But the question we must ask, the question that Lincoln asked Polk, is whether the stated justification matches the actual evidence and whether the real purpose is what we were told. The term Cartel de los Soles has a history that should concern anyone paying attention. It originated in 1993, not as a description of a criminal organization, but as a journalistic label following a political scandal. And that scandal involved, of all things, a CIA operation. Venezuelan General Ramon Guillen de Villa, who headed Venezuela's National Guard anti-drug unit, was discovered to have approved cocaine shipments to the United States. He claimed he was working with undercover CIA agents attempting to infiltrate Colombian cartels. Anyone who's ever read about or watched the movies, like the Tom Cruise movie on Barry Seals, or you read about the Iran-Contra affair, you watch Narcos on Netflix, you understand that the CIA has been at the center of the South American drug industry and related scandals for decades. I mean, this particular scandal was reported on by Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes and covered by the New York Times. The cartel was born from a CIA drug-running operation under pro-U.S. Venezuelan government. The term then disappeared for years, only to be revived when the U.S. government began targeting officials in the Chavez and Maduro governments. The informal network of corrupt military officials that the U.S. now labels narco-terrorists were, in fact, again, established by the CIA under governments at that time friendly to Washington. It's mind-blowing how this pattern repeats itself throughout the world. The Polk template. Consider how precisely this follows the template that we discussed in Article 2. First, establish the predicate. Polk claimed disputed territory was American soil. The current administration claimed a journalistic slang term was a terrorist cartel. Second, manufacture urgency. Polk ordered troops into harm's way. The current administration escalated bounties, designated terrorist organizations, and built up naval forces in the Caribbean, along with drone bombing, shipping for months. Third, present the fait accompli. Polk delivered a war message to Congress after blood had been shed. The current administration extracted Maduro before anyone could question the legal basis, and then claimed he had no choice because Congress was full of leakers. They would leak. Fourth, manage critics. Anyone questioning the intervention is accused of defending drug trafficking, just as Lincoln was accused of disloyalty for questioning Polk. And here's what Trump actually said. President Trump actually said after the extraction about the real reason we're in Venezuela. He said explicitly that the goal is to take control of Venezuela's oil reserve and hand them to U.S.-based companies. Or, as he said at the end of last week, maybe refill our strategic reserves. Not drugs. Certainly not fentanyl, which was never coming from Venezuela to begin with. But oil and strategic resources. The Cartel de las Solas was this administration's version of weapons of mass destruction. Useful for building the case, quietly abandoned when it had to be proven. Let's now turn from Venezuela to Iran, where a slightly different pattern emerges. Not necessarily the manufactured predicate, but I want to talk about the consisting, shifting objective. In the Mexican-American War, Polk knew what he wanted: California and the Southwest. The manufactured incident was a means to this predetermined end. With Iran, something a little bit stranger is happening. The stated American objective keeps changing, as if we're searching for any justification that will stick, any rationale that will support the conclusion already reached. Come with me, let's trace this evolution. And I'm not going back all the way to the 90s, and certainly not to 1953. I'm not even going back to the early 2000s. I'm just going to go back 1 year. Last year, early 2025. The stated concern was uranium enrichment. Iran was enriching to 60%, well beyond the percentage permitted under the 2015 nuclear deal, and approaching the 90% threshold needed for nuclear weapons-grade material. This was a legitimate proliferation concern. In fact, that was the point. To Iran, enrichment was arguably a deterrent. Maybe their only real deterrent against an Israel-U.S. alliance against them. I mean, after all, North Korea has a nuclear program. Libya does not. Which outcome do you think the mullahs prefer? So negotiations began. But the American negotiation position was, from the start, one that experts called unrealistic. National Security Advisor Michael Waltz told Fox News that Iran must give up their entire program. Complete dismantlement of all nuclear capabilities, including enrichment permitted under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Arms control experts were pretty blunt. This was a demand Iran would never accept, and one that seemed designed purposefully to fail. And thus a 12-day war ensued. Then the objective shifted. It was no longer just enrichment, it was missiles. Iran's ballistic missile program, we were told, posed an unacceptable threat. Intercontinental capabilities that could reach American allies, perhaps America itself. The Iranians pointed out that missiles were not covered by the nuclear deal. And they pointed out that all the other nations in the region, they possess missiles too. But the goalposts had moved. Then, more recently, the objective shifted again. Now the concern is protesters. Protesters? We're now told that Iran must stop mistreating its protesters or else. Let me be absolutely clear. The Iranian regime does suppress protesters. It does commit human rights abuses. It has killed demonstrators in the streets. These are documented facts. They are indefensible on a humanitarian level. But, and I need you to follow the logic here, we have now moved from Iran must not enrich uranium beyond certain levels, which is concrete, verifiable, negotiable, to Iran must not possess certain missiles, which is broader and harder to verify, to Iran must treat its citizens according to standards we define. Which is what exactly? How would Iran demonstrate compliance with this demand? Would international inspectors observe protest management? Would there be a treaty specifying acceptable crowd control measures? Is there any conceivable agreement that would satisfy this requirement? Other than the sitting president of the U.S. saying he was satisfied or unsatisfied with reports coming to him from the intelligence community? You know, the same ones who told us about WMDs in Iraq. Or, and I want you to consider this seriously, is this simply a demand that cannot be met, offered precisely because it cannot be met, in order to justify the conclusion that was reached before any of these negotiations began? Consider, Saudi Arabia suppresses protesters. Egypt suppresses protesters. Our allies throughout the Gulf suppress protesters. We do not threaten them with military action. We sell them weapons. Or consider this. A protester on January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C., of all places, was shot dead by Capitol Police. And of course, a protester in Minneapolis was shot dead by ICE this year. Do other countries threaten military action against the U.S. for these actions? The protesters' rationale is not about protesters. It's about finding, at last, a justification that cannot be negotiated away, a justification that can be used at the discretion of the intelligence community and whomever the sitting president of the United States may be at that time. We began with nuclear proliferation, a concrete concern with specific metrics. We moved to missiles, a diffuse concern broader in scope. And now we've arrived at internal governance. This is a rationale that could justify intervention in dozens of countries. There's no clear endpoint, can't be solved by any conceivable agreement. It's almost as if we're searching for any excuse that will support any regime change we want. When one rationale proves insufficient, we simply add another. The pattern is all too familiar. In Iraq, we began with weapons of mass destruction. When those weren't found, the objective became democracy promotion. But when that proved elusive, it became regional stability. The goalposts moved until we had been in war for 2 decades without ever achieving a stable endpoint. And then there's the question that is almost never asked in these discussions. But it is the question that Lincoln asked about the Mexican-American War, and the question that the anti-imperialist asked about the Philippines. What happens after? Iran is not Iraq. It's not Libya. It's not Syria. Iran has a population of over 85 million people. That's more than double Iraq's population when we invaded in 2003. It has a sophisticated military and intelligence apparatus. And it's 2.5 times the size of Texas, with mountainous terrain that make occupation extraordinarily difficult. It has allies and proxies throughout the region who would not simply just accept American victory. But even if we achieve the military objective, even if we destroy nuclear facilities, even if we achieve regime change, what follows? The aftermath in Iraq produced a decade of insurgency, the rise of ISIS, hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, trillions of dollars spent, and a country that remains unstable 20 years later. The aftermath in Libya produced a failed state, warring militias, open-air slave markets, and a migrant crisis that destabilized Europe. The aftermath in Syria produced a civil war that killed 500,000 people and displaced millions more. The aftermath in Iran could be worse than all of these combined. A country of 85 million with ethnic minorities that could fracture into separatist movements. Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Arabs. A Shia majority in a region where Sunni Shia conflict has already produced catastrophic violence. A power vacuum that would draw in every regional actor with an interest in the outcome. We saw in June 2025 what military action against Iran produces. Israeli strikes on nuclear facilities, U.S. strikes that followed, Iranian missile responses against American bases in Qatar, a 12-day war that damaged Iran's nuclear program, but did not end the underlying conflict, did not produce a negotiated settlement, did not resolve any of the fundamental questions. The founders understood that wars have consequences beyond their immediate objective. Madison warned that no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. The anti-imperialists warned that the Philippines would become a strategic liability. And they were indicated at Bataan. And now, we have been warned. The question is whether or not we will listen. There's a final thread from Article 2 that has become alarmingly relevant. The question of territorial expansion, of annexation, of acquiring new territories through pressure or force. In our article, we examined Grover Cleveland's refusal to annex Hawaii in 1893. American planners had overthrown the Queen with active support of U.S. Marines. The Harrison administration had negotiated an annexation treaty, and then Cleveland took office. He investigated, found the overthrow illegitimate, and withdrew the treaty. His words to Congress deserve repetition, and I know I said it on Saturday's episode, but as I said, I want to repeat this so that it really sinks in. I mistake the American people if they favor the odious doctrine that there is no such thing as international morality. That there is one law for a strong nation and another for a weak one. And that even by indirection, a strong power may, with impunity, despoil a weak one of its territory. Cleveland was applying a principle that America should not acquire territory through fraud, coercion, or force. That the consent of the governed matters. That power does not make right. Last week, a bill was introduced in Congress by Congressman Randy Fine to annex Greenland and make it the 51st state. The Greenland Annexation and Statehood Act. It would authorize the president to take whatever steps necessary to acquire Greenland. The language that explicitly does not exclude military force. The president himself has refused to rule out military action against Denmark, a NATO ally, in order to seize the territory. And Greenland's prime minister has responded. No more pressure, no more hints, no more fantasies about annexation. When the president of the United States talks about we need Greenland and connects us with Venezuela and military intervention, it's not just wrong, it's so disrespectful. The people of Greenland do not want to be annexed. Polls show overwhelming opposition. Their elected leaders have said clearly and repeatedly that their territory is not for sale, that their future is not determined by American ambition. And yet the pressure continues. The threats continue. The rhetoric of one way or the other continues. This is precisely what Cleveland warned against. This is precisely the pattern we traced in Article 2. The pressure, the coercion, the assumption that American interests override the rights of smaller nations to determine their own fate. Venezuela, taken by military force, their assets expropriated. Greenland, threatened with the same. The president has also floated the annexation of Canada. Probably in jest. Probably. But he's also talked about the retaking of the Panama Canal, while also throwing veiled threats at Cuba and Mexico. I do not use the word empire loosely. I use it because that is what this is. An empire is a political entity that acquires territory without the consent of its inhabitants, that projects power beyond its borders to control the resources and governance of other peoples, that operates on the assumption that might makes right. Cleveland understood that such conduct was incompatible with American principles. He understood that there is no such thing as international morality if the strong may simply despoil the weak of their territory. We're being told that these acquisitions are necessary for national security. We were told the same about Hawaii. We were told the same about the Philippines. The justification is always national security. The reality is something else. In Venezuela, a cartel that dissolves upon examination, a predicate that cannot survive legal scrutiny, an intervention justified by claims that prosecutors themselves have quietly abandoned. In Iran, objectives that shift whenever the previous rationale proves insufficient, goalposts that move until any pretext will serve. In Greenland and beyond, the open discussion of annexation, the pressure, threats against smaller nations, the assumption that American power justifies American acquisition. Lincoln saw it in 1848. Cleveland saw it in 1893. The anti-imperialists saw it in 1898. The question for us, for all of us who consume the news, who vote, who form opinions, who constitute the public, whose consent is supposedly required for these actions, is whether we will see it now. The patterns are not subtle. The history is not obscure. The template is visible to anyone who cares to look. As you follow these events in the coming weeks and months, ask the questions we have been asking throughout this series. Is the stated justification consistent with the evidence, or does it shift when closely examined? What happens after the immediate objective is achieved? Has anyone articulated a realistic vision of the aftermath? Whose consent has been sought? Whose rights have been considered? Or are we proceeding on the assumption that American interests, and to put a point on that, American intel agency interest, override all other considerations? And does this leave Americans more free or more governed? Does it leave the world more stable or more dangerous? On Sunday, we released Article 3, which examined 1898, the year America crossed the threshold from continental republic to overseas empire, the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of the Philippines, the brutal counterinsurgency that followed, and the anti-imperialist league's arguments, which, as you see, remain as relevant today as they were 127 years ago. And coming up this Saturday, a corresponding podcast episode that will expand on those themes. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Episode 2, Part B of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the Founders to the Forever Wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. Here you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcasts. And if you like this episode, hit that thumbs up button below. That really helps. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.